Okay. Good evening, Mr. Ariel. Herzlich willkommen im Goethe-Institut. We have an event tonight and I'm very pleased to welcome you. My name is Johanna Keller, I'm the head of arts here at Goethe-Institut Cairo, and this event tonight is organized in the context of something else. We are very grateful that you're here and that we can be part of the event that was opened 2 days ago on the 28th, and today is now the third evening, and it has 2 parts at Goethe-Institut. So we now have this talk at 5, we're a bit late. Then at 7 we have the exhibition opening at Cinema Radio, and at 9 you're very much welcome to come back to Goethe-Institut because we're going to have a performance by Mongi Hutter, an artist couple from Germany. So please be welcome to spend the evening with us. Now we're going to start with a discussion around the topic of the actuality of the ancient contemporary art icons and identity. This panel was organized by 2 artists from Germany, Nora Al-Badri and Nikolai Nelles. Nora Al-Badri is here with us. So they themselves did an artwork for the exhibition that is going to be opened at 7 at Cinema Radio. You might say controversial artwork because they did actually a copy of Nefertiti. You know that Nefertiti is with the Germans in Berlin. It belongs to the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz, to the Foundation of Prussian Cultural Heritage. The artists pick up the very critical question whether this is a correct situation, or whether we should also discuss the context, how the artwork actually got to Germany, and what it means that it is in Berlin and who has the right to use it, etc. So it is a question that bears a lot of controversy. This is also why I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. The panel is going to be moderated by Angela Boskovic. She's going to be the moderator. She sits in the middle of the other panelists, and Angela Boskovic is also going to present the other panelists. So I only have the pleasure to welcome every one of you, to let you know that we are grateful that you're here to participate in the discussion. We do have translation into Arabic. في ترجمة إلى اللغة العربية، إذا تحبوا خذوا السماعات من آخر الصالة. كمان ممكن تسألوا أسئلة بالعربي. يعني the audience also has the opportunity to ask questions in Arabic, so you're going to be able to listen to the translation. Because of the translation equipment, I kindly ask you to switch off your mobile phones. So not only to put them in silent mode, but to completely switch them off. We're very sorry for this inconvenience, but there is a reconnection with the translation equipment, so you might have this disturbing noise when you listen to the translation. So thanks for switching off, and I wish you a very pleasant evening, and hopefully see you later for the other events as well. And thanks again to Darb 1718 and Something Else for this cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna, for the greeting, and all of you for coming this evening, and hopefully maybe some more will be coming in as they leave work for the day and have attended other art events around the city. And thank you as well to Nora and to Nikolai for the exhibition and for initiating the panel. We have really 4 very qualified people to discuss the topic of contemporary art and archaeology, identity and heritage. So I just want to introduce them briefly to you. Here on the left we have Professor Susanne Leeb. She's a professor of contemporary art in the University of Lüneburg in Germany. She specializes in post-colonial histories and the connection between contemporary art, history and culture, and she's very active to monitor some of the new initiatives coming up in Germany around so-called world art museums and what this means for the community. Then next we have Simon Njami. He's an author, a curator, and the main curator here with the Something Else of Biennale, which is hosting many great events around the city, from visual arts to performances, so definitely get out and watch it if you can. Then we have Dr. Monica Hanna. She's an archaeologist, Egyptologist, and conservationist with a social media account to match. She has a page I encourage you all to check out called the Egypt Task Force, and she's monitoring Egypt Heritage Task Force, and she's monitoring the antiquities surrounding Egypt, what's looted, what's being taken out in illegal digs, and also what's being sold abroad. So she's really a person to follow on Twitter and on Facebook. As well, she won the 2014 Safe Beacon Award, which is given to those who are working to preserve heritage for all. And lastly, we have Alexander Koch. He's a gallerist, an author, and a cultural activist. He has the KOW Gallery in Berlin, one of the only galleries of its kind to initiate socially oriented art in Berlin. And also he is working with a project both in Germany and around Africa called the New Patrons Program, which initiates art projects from citizens. So it's another interpretation of art. So to get started, we wanted to discuss a little bit of what is the role between archaeologists and artists in contemporary art, and what are the practices that are currently ongoing between artists and archaeologists, whether in the context of these world art museums, so-called, or in archaeological sites. So if we want to start with Dr. Leeb.
Shall I comment a little bit on the new developments? Yeah. So I mean, to say that there is not a very the discussion on contemporary art and archaeology just starts now, but it's only like in Germany, this whole history, which is a colonial history, was for a long time not really discussed because we had to deal so much already with our Nazi past, so that the colonial times was a little bit neglected. And only since like post-colonial voices become more stronger and stronger, these like especially ethnographic museums are questioned more and more. Ethnographic museums, which doesn't concern Egypt so much because Egypt was always on the, let's say on the side of a division which was made in 19th century Germany of cultural nations and natural nations, or natural folks and cultural folks. So that means in the ethnographic museums, mostly all the objects and artifacts from Africa and Oceania, Polynesia were mostly collected, whereas like India, China, Egypt fell on the high culture side. So that's a little bit an interesting story. That's why contemporary artists who deal with ethnographic museums at the moment, they don't really deal with the question of archaeology, so there are very few artists, and we have the chance tonight to see one couple who deals, or two artists who deal with this history, but they focus mostly on the post-colonial history of ethnographic museums. So this is kind of an interesting, maybe still something to do, because even I think many people are not aware and how far archaeology is still came out of the imperial history, and this is not told in the museums. There is no self-reflection in the museums themselves. So this is why I think artists are very important, because at the moment it's like activists, artists who try to raise the discussion on the representations in the museum, how to tell the story. Because when you go to the museums, it is very unclear to whom which story has been told. I mean, like Europe and every single nation there, like build up their own identity through looting the cultural heritage of other countries. And so the self-understanding and through possessing other people, Tony Bennett, the museum scientist, called it, to have the power, or to possess the goods of other people means to possess their history, it means to have power over them. So this part, so this is why a debate is absolutely necessary, and it's exactly slowly starting. Maybe that for a short entry, and the others may comment and we can go further.
I think that the question of possession is a very key one, because when you're talking about art, be it archaeological, be it ancient, be it whatever, they have a bunch of terminology of that. art premier, blah, blah, blah. Whatever it is the symbol of some civilization, be it high, like Egypt, India, China, or be it low, like the rest of the world, except of course the West. But I remember something regarding this possession of memory and of history. It was a text by Leopold Sédar Senghor, who was saying the European, or the master, the colonizer, are saying that we have no history, we have no master, we have no philosophers. And then his answer was that we had masters, we had philosophers, they're all locked in European museums, and we're deprived of our memory, and we have to reconstruct our memory out of that missing link. So I think that the notion of missing link is quite important, and I'm sure we'll come to it later, is that of course the museum is a structure, a power structure, and this notion of world art is replacing more or less what was called universal art when the Louvre, all those museums were constructed. It's not so much to give education to people than to show the power of the country that were possessing them. So by possessing things from all the world, you were possessing the world, and you were showing to your neighbors that you're stronger than them. So it was a very macho battle going on between nations. And it's true that the German case is a bit ambiguous, because I remember that not so long ago some Germans would tell me, well, we never had colonial possessions. So it's interesting that they're recovering some of that memory.
Well, when they just start now to introduce German colonial history in the school books. So it wasn't taught in school books until now. So just to show you the negation of that part of history.
I would just like to add that since, for my feeling, like the late 80s, there has been a tremendous amount at the same time of post-colonial discussion, a lot of artists actually addressing the history of global inequalities, because that wasn't said, and maybe it's interesting for you also to hear that at times it could seem that it is even a mainstream discourse in some parts of Germany to actually deconstruct our own position in this history, including the ways of public representation of that history, to deconstruct museology, etc. So this already has a long, long history, I would say. Not exactly, as you said, with regard to archaeology, but with regard to the entire setup of the hierarchies and hegemonies that were created over times, and that we meet in our daily lives in many European cities, because we have all these museums sitting around telling these stories that we ourselves don't believe in. At least the critical part of the people and artists have done a tremendous amount of work, I think, to take an institutional critical point on that.
Just to follow up, Alexander, with your new patrons program, is there any way that if the artifacts are locked, for example, in the European museums or in the German museums, that your new patrons program works with the figures or the motifs? Or
Well, the approach of the new patrons program is basically to build structures that allow the civil society, the citizens, actually, to articulate their interests, their perspective, and not artists, curators, or museum directors telling them what their culture is. So whatever comes up in discussions like that, I would say, do we actually understand what the people would like as their story to be told, or as a change to happen? What objects would they actually want to have in possession, whether of their national museum? Are they actually interested in creating a national narrative? Are there other narratives or societal self-descriptions that they would want to be told? And how much do we understand about that? And often my feeling is Like we as experts and many people who run the art world and the museum world have a very, very small understanding of what the people really think, and believe and want and need, because we actually don't talk to the people. Most of them don't. And the idea of the new patrons program is that we try to talk to the people first, or basically offer ourselves to be addressed by the people, whoever wants actually to have a conversation. And what is the strongest idea for me within that context is that the people, the citizens, are actually commissioners. We create a situation, financial, social, political situation, where citizens can become commissioners of exhibitions, of new artistic productions, and we provide the knowledge and background that we have. And this is, for me, at least the most wonderful way that I found in my professional biography to take a much more humble and modest position on our side and say it's not about our interests, it's basically about your interests. Yeah. And I don't know, if once we would really have that conversation, we actually don't know what comes out with regard to the topics that we're discussing here.
I think it's also a very interesting notion to think about how the original cultures think about the display of their objects in German museums. Thinking earlier story that we spoke about a few years ago, Professor Wildung put the bust of Nefertiti on the podium in Ekebune. And the Egyptian society here was very furious. That you cannot do that to our queen. And they voiced out their refusal, and eventually it was the Artist Museum back then had to change the pedestal upon which the bust of Nefertiti was. So I think there's almost no non-existent discourse between the objects that were looted in the 19th century from Egypt and their representation in German museums.
No, but what a museum, what fascinates me in the museum institution is that it is the fabrication of myth. It's the institutionalization of fakeness. Because the story that is told in those museums is a fake one. And then at times, what is interesting is that the people from whom those pieces were taken will embrace the story. They would embrace the fiction that is constructed outside to make it their own. So we're like in a total confusion. And if people would simply realize that the displacement of an object transforms its very essence. The head of Nefertiti, that is in the German museum in Berlin, is not the head of Nefertiti anymore. It is just the appearance of the head of Nefertiti. Because every one of those objects there had a function. It's like when you see a dancing mask in the Galerie, a dancing mask in a glass screen that doesn't dance, that has no other outfit. It's not a dancing mask anymore, it becomes something else. So one of the things of the museum, one of its functions, and I think it's a political function, ideological function, is to detour the object from their very meaning. And there's a moment where, I don't know if the meaning is still there, if somebody remembers whatever. But then, if I would, in that case, there's a friend of mine she was fired, running the Welt Museum in Frankfurt. And she invited me once to do a residency there. And I was wondering what I would do. Anyway, I didn't have the time to do it. But my project was to select 4 or 5 objects there and to create a biography. A totally fake, quote-unquote, biography. But that would look real, which is basically what the museum are doing.
Yeah, I think this debate, which kind of histories or which narrations are narratives actually are constructed around objects in museums is a really crucial question, and I think it really should go to every kind of museum, and especially if they're kind of states museums. And I think we have, like, from what you said already, we have a kind of really difficult or a clash even of interests, because usually museums are state-run. That means they represent a state's position with your suggestion that the civil society should engage and also be asked how far they can contribute to the museum, which stories do the people want to be represented, is often, I mean, you have, in a way, you have the same problem with how to organize a democracy. I mean, is it top down or bottom up? And well, certainly it should be bottom up, but it's usually, yeah, we have. Okay. And so in a way, if we really would take this is always like a claim I would do, if we would take museums seriously as public places and public spaces, I mean, they would be really differently. And this is something, in a way, it's interesting because it's really accepted also from the people that the museums are the museums. And you go there and in a way, you don't really question what is there, which stories are told, and for whom these stories are told. And I think this is kind of there's no really an awareness that museums are public places, I think. And I mean, maybe this is not here the problem, but certainly a lot with the dominance of private collections at the moment, that this is even less democratically decided what is shown, because you have like collectors who buy what they want and then they make these donations to the museums. So that means that the museums have like less money. So they don't really participate anymore in the selection of what should be cultural heritage at some point. So this is maybe a contemporary problem, but I think this clash between in how far should people be involved in what is shown and which stories are told is one thing. And the other thing is certainly, I mean, this is the imperial, the kind of, which the Frankfurt Museum you were talking about, which they brought it up because Clémentine de Lis, what she did was the first one and really bravely kind of taking the whole collection out of the museum and only inviting artists, curators, writers to somehow deal with the collection, and that was really like an outcry. I saw the visitors' book and said, "Where is our ethnographic museum? We want our objects back. This is not possible." When I wrote a critique, but from a different point of view. So again, but I said there's a difference between solidarity, like a critique which is in principle in solidarity with what is done, and a critique which is kind of like pushing down. So I understood, But anyway, so just to see that this is very, what she brought up is the question, like, which story are we telling? Are we just exhibiting objects? So is it in a way something? So we fuel in a way a touristic gaze, or do we produce antiquities, valuable objects? So what does the museum produce, or is it telling, or which story is it telling? And the museums usually argue they are part of our history. So I'm always like which is why my history? If this is our history, it's colonial history, and this history is not told. So it's very, or is it world art? And they say we tell the history of this was
19th century narrative. We tell the history of the world. This was the main motive to found these museums in Germany, at least. Certainly it was colonial, but also with a kind of a humanistic embracing of, let's tell the story of mankind. So we need collections from all over the world in order to be able to tell the story of mankind. And still today they say, okay, we tell the story of mankind. It's there for all people, but well, you know how difficult it is to get visa to Europe and to Germany, so the world has no access. So for me, it's completely not clear in any of these museums which story we tell. And with Nefertiti, it was a bit different case because it was so much embraced already in the 20s by the Berlin people. And there was a famous silent movie by Ernst Lubitsch, The Pharaoh and His Wife, which came out at the same time. So it was immediately kind of, the people immediately identified. And but still, there's this huge missing link, which story is told, and I don't actually have an answer.
Yeah, I'd like to add one thing and push it even a little bit further. Like, I think we understand that an object has never a meaning in itself. So what the meaning actually is the social usage of that object. Yeah, you could also say these objects are one dimension of our social behavior. So you can try to think it from the end and say what sort of social behavior and social relationship do we actually want to have or inspire, and what objects have what purpose in that project. And then you can also try to ask different questions, like Nefertiti represents a queen, and you can also say this is the representation of aristocracy, where today we go into a new era of neo-aristocracy maybe, and some of these people have been actually mass murders. So what is the social history of these objects? And not only to talk about the aesthetic history of these objects, yeah? And this somehow shifts conversations about what is the value of something, you know? And I like the pragmatist approach to actually say where are we trying to get through the usage of this and that object, and that goes a little bit beyond narrative. It's actually about social relationships.
Well, I would rather we go also a step further. I mean, earlier, before its interpretation in the modern societies, that most objects put, for example, in the new Egyptian exhibition in the Noise Museum, most of the objects are put as art objects with almost no context, with no side interpretation. They're just there to inspire you to look, to give you this expression, without proper interpretation. It doesn't give you context. It doesn't give you even the social history. It doesn't give you any context. For example, a wig. There's really no explanation other than it's a wig found in this tomb from this dynasty. But does it tell you about what women wore? What was that a wig was part of social status, or a wig was worn because that woman did not have hair? I mean, that really gives you minimal context, historic context, so that people would not really identify with this object. They would not look at ancient Egypt as if it was a living culture, but rather as a completely dead culture that we cannot identify with.
And I think that when you say dead, when going back to the crucial point of those museums, I think that those museums are even better than pyramids. They're tombs. They're places where people are trying to address a history of which they have no knowledge, and they're freezing those objects in a time and space. It's as if I was freezing you today, not knowing what you did yesterday and what you'll be doing tomorrow. I say, this is you. I freeze you, I put you in a museum. I say, well, her, Dr. Dada, she was giving a lecture at the Goethe. Boom, basta, finish. So this is one of the very problems of the relationship between those objects that are dead with us who are alive. And I think that instead of dealing with the institutional lie, let's admit that there's no truth, there's no such a thing as a truth. But instead of dealing with the institutional lie, I'd rather deal with the artistic lie, which at least doesn't claim to be a truth. An artist like Galerie, I've been working with objects, and I don't know how to call them. Are they art? Are they things? And say things, trying to precisely reconstruct and rebuild and discuss this notion of memory. And he has a whole project talking about reparation, use broken mirror that he sewed together, etc., etc. And I think that the other Nefertiti, as Borisien, the writer, said once in the introduction of his novel, he said, this novel is true, this story is true from A to Z because I invented it. So now, this Nefertiti, is it more or less real than the other one? For me, it might be even more real because the other one is frozen. And the fact that that one is existing now leads us and forces us to question the other one. I mean, that one is legitimated. It's made by people who are alive, and I can question them, and they can tell me why. The other one, I don't know. I would like to have a full ID, and I think that there's a lot of missing things on her passport, and we don't even know if she had a visa when she came in.
Is there an ethical use of the new archaeological artifacts, things, objects that are found every day? We hear about lootings and so many artifacts going up for sale in all the auction houses, Sotheby's, Christie's. What is the ethical use? Is there for artists, for museums, for human history?
Unfortunately, many collectors and many museums are secretly, actively buying off the looted antiquities market. And again, no one is going to loot unless there is a big market. So if you stop the market, looting is going to stop. More objects, we've once calculated around 200 to 150 objects leave Egypt every day to markets in Europe, in the Gulf, which are becoming the new museums. They're building these huge new museums. Yes, in a way. And also to North America. So all these markets are just completely raiding the archaeological sites, because most of the looters who go on archaeological sites, they do not go with a trowel and a brush, or with even a camera. They go with a bulldozer, with huge hose. They just try to destroy anything on their way to find an object to sell. Usually they sell it also for peanuts to the local antiquities dealer, who then sells it to the bigger antiquities dealer, who then manages to smuggle it out of Egypt. And we had a very recent case where even someone from, I will not mention the country, it's a European country, was arrested because he was smuggling antiquities in his diplomatic briefcase. So, and they were even putting fake artifacts in the Egyptian magazine. So what they were doing is that they were making a copy, leaving the copy here in Egypt, and taking the originals abroad. And unfortunately, most of the academics in the field of heritage are very scared of addressing this problem. They, many of them check objects and quantify objects and tell collectors, oh, this is worth this and this is worth this. Very, very little ethical regard to the country they're working at. And many of them who are not actively participating in that, they're just participating in the crime by being silent. People, very few German academics have spoken, except I think for Reinhard Bernbeck, because he doesn't work in Egypt, and have spoken about the looting problem in Egypt. So there is really a very strong ethical question towards academics. What are they doing to stop the looting? Are they happy with the looting? Because in a way they're benefiting, they're getting objects undocumented that are just losing their history. Around 70% of the history of an object is lost when it's looted. It turns from a historic object with context into just a mere artifact. So that's a good question.
Yeah, and I think if we go now from museums also to private collectors and the market, I would say it's part of this larger matrix where a few people in the world try to get as much financial capital and symbolic capital on their side and not allowing the others to have much of it. And actually the collection of art, contemporary art, ancient art is one of these things that these people actually do. And it's about power, symbolic power, but it's also about pure money. And some of these people are probably sitting in this country, some people are sitting in other countries. Yeah? So this ongoing theft is actually somehow a collaboration between many different actors in this world. Yeah? And this topic has been addressed by many artists in the past and in the present. To be clear, there's a whole artistic discourse that is very, very critical about this.
I think what we're left of is just holes. Holes in history, holes on our archaeological sites, and I think holes in our ethical conscience as well, because we're unable really to react to that.
Yes, but precisely when we're talking about ethics, you mentioned Sotheby's, and I think that as far as those things are concerned, the only ethics that function is that of Sotheby's. But it's one thing to blame Sotheby's, it's one thing to blame whoever. Of course, they are to be blamed. But there's also one thing about local responsibilities. It's one thing to ask the art critic, the archaeologist, the anthropologist to write about it. It's another thing to tell to the guy who's selling to the other guy, who will be selling to the big guy, and that the thing will be out, to tell him that his is selling part of his soul. Well, he's free to sell his soul, but at least he should know it. And I don't think that job is done. It's like this basic education. And I think that when it goes to all the questions we talk about, there's always a shared responsibility. That's how the market functions. It takes somebody to sell, to find somebody to buy. And as you were saying, the rare the merchandise is, the more expensive.
I do agree, and I think it has to do also with the whole mentality here that it's the state who owns the culture, and people really do not feel the ownership of their own culture. It's the state that decides what to excavate, which land to appropriate for excavation, what to put on museums. It's well, hopefully. I think also that a part of what we need to propagate is that people should see buying antiquities as buying blood diamonds. People need to think that it's uncool to buy antiquities, that it's no longer an object of prestige. Because even in a small village in Middle Egypt called Abu Sir al-Malik, 20 children die yearly for digging for antiquities. They fall in the deep shafts, they get sanded over, and they die. So I think the West needs to see that buying this object from this auction has blood on it, and not just stripping off, of course, the history of the object.
Plus, as Simon said, if that is right, I'd like to know, someone told me yesterday that the law in Egypt is made in such a way that it really disencourages you to, if whenever you find an object, to actually give it to the state or to a museum collection, and you better not do it and find other ways to deal with it. That's what I was told yesterday.
This is unfortunately the case, and I do agree. And I think it also comes back to the state's policy. They're interested in building new grand museums and that are basically vanity projects, rather than really giving proper and due attention to protecting the sites and the objects. So I definitely agree.
Yeah, but I mean, it's really interesting, like, again, about the story of, like, where can you tell which story? Because if the story was told, like, if it was really uncool, and I think this is the right way to, but it would be also a story it's really not good to have ethnographic museums, which are just renamed world museums or world art museums, so they don't change the structure, they don't change the statues of the possessions, they only just they rename themselves in order to, in a way, a little bit hide this history of ethnography, but it's the structure and the objects stay all the same. But if the story would be told in museums, I mean, there's this gap of consequences, and this is something I'm also interested in when contemporary artists, I mean, many of the museums now, they try to invite contemporary artists to, in a way, work with their collections. And this is a kind of very ambiguous question, because usually, I mean, it's if you are against something, but you're invited by the person you're against, you're in a difficult moral position. Usually you don't attack your host, which you would need to do. So the most critical artworks I know who deal with these questions, they came without commission. They came from artists who thought about it deeply and thought this is not right. But as soon as you are invited, in a way you become part of the whole game. And this is something what's his name? Like a colleague of mine, he said, like, any artist who uncritically supports these museums or even works for the collection or with the collection, but doesn't find any way to find at least a way of symbolic restitution or bringing these things out or completely deconstructing the logic of the museums, is taking part in legalizing these enterprises or endeavors. And so this is a little bit a difficult question for me also, but if you have critical art, how to, usually the museums think they can get away with inviting artists and then, we show the criticality. But they don't take the consequences and the challenges which are formulated by the artists. And I think many contemporary artists, they formulate a challenge. But but people are so used to the claim of contemporary art that contemporary art is critical, that they think, oh yeah, it's critical. let's think about it. But they don't take the art seriously enough, I think. I think this is a little bit the problem of contemporary art reflecting on these institutions being exhibited within, but the museums don't change the policies, but just show how critical they are. And the Musée du Quai Branly, for example, in Paris would be a great example, because they have a really problematic exhibition upstairs, and then the cellar, they have a highly critical discussion program. So it's divided. Yeah, the cellar, we have this kind of like, yeah, these talks, but they don't touch the museum policies at all.
And there's this trend of labeling and this trend of inviting contemporary artists in those spaces is really, it makes me think like an old prostitute who would try to gain a new virginity. And of course, who is fooled? And in this strategy, the artist doesn't matter. The artist is instrumentalized, because he doesn't realize that his criticality within the museum will remain silent. But then the guy is just like this guy, Jean-Marie Le Pen, but now even his daughter fired him from the party. But when people would tell to Le Pen, you're a racist, say, come on, I have an old friend. So this is exactly the same kind of strategies those museums are using. Say, well, you're dealing with this well. I invited a contemporary artist. So, of course, it's disobéissance civile. I don't know how to translate that. We should steal those objects. We should make them available. We should all be kind of Robin Hoods. And not necessarily to give them to the people, because it's true that I don't know the people, but I don't think that the people are better than the others, because from the bottom to the top, it's one people who will become a dictator or a president of a deputy. So to give back is not necessarily the thing. I think what we have to do is to have a critical discourse about those objects, about their meanings, and about what we're going to do with it. I mean, if we talk about world art, which is already very problematic, how come that the world art is concentrated in a tiny little space that we call Europe? I mean, if it were really world art, Europe would not be big enough. So I think that one of the program that the Germans should do is, for instance, to build things in places and say, okay, this is world art. We're touring our collection. We're paying for everything. The Chokwe masks are going to be sent to the Chokwe people. We'll keep them, we'll safeguard them, because we have system, we have high technology, we know how to deal with that geometry. But anyone who wants to see it, he will be able to see it not by coming to the Louvre or to whatever, but we'll send them to him. We pay for everything. We'll take them back to the safe box that is the European Museum. And that's one of the solutions. It would become world art.
Community spaces, archaeologists, academics, to encourage these dialogues. We are here tonight because two contemporary artists initiated a conversation about an artifact in Berlin, stolen artifact in Berlin, with an archaeologist, with an academic. So are there, precedents or models where we can interact?
I just remember briefly when there was a great European celebration that were called colonial something, where you could see a village in Paris with the colonial exhibitions. There's something for the one in Paris in 1930, where the surrealists published tract, etc., and was saying, don't go to the colonial exhibition. So one thing, if we boycott those museums, what would happen?
Yeah, well, but this is, this really needs to create public awareness. This is really, we were maybe only at the beginning of being creating that kind of awareness. And I was, just last week, I was in the so-called Museum of Folk Art, no, Völkerkunde Museum. It's really an awkward term. It's pre-ethnographic, so when really, like, people's museum or whatever. And they have an annual market where people from different parts of the world sell their goods. So you cannot bring it more closely together. The whole idea of merchandising, and so, I mean, the whole World Art Museum came out of the World Exhibitions when Britain in 1851 was creating the first World Exhibition, and it was only for advertisement for creating free trade zones. So it wasn't about culture, not at all. It was about creating an empire. And I think this kind of, I mean, this museum is still, I mean, we have post-colonial history in Germany, but they still are kind of using the museums as a place to sell, like, however you want to tell these goods, but whatever, ethnographic fake stuff.
Memorabilia.
Memorabilia, yeah, exactly. So, but what I wanted also to say, but I think it's important also to work from your question, what we can do, and it certainly is telling stories of entanglement. I think Nefertiti is a great case to tell stories from different angles, and to see how they intertwine. And I think it wouldn't be a solution to say, well, I would say it certainly would belong here, but it's not enough to say this is there, but also in a way to narrate stories around an object like that, how people are really entangled and to which conditions are they entangled, and also conditions of inequality, to use these objects for different narratives. And but it's also important, I think, to start in each situation. I think criticism can only work also again from bottom up, and I mean this is the beauty of academics also, like for me, to create a public, trying to help at least to create a public awareness. But that would also be the case from here to work, like which is the position, why this is a state symbol. So what is the affection? Why is it so important? Is it important to have state symbols? For whom to identify with? Why? With objects? I mean, we're very far from these stories in museums, and we're talking very much about the future. But I think this is what a scholar once said. This is the surplus value of globalization. Not only thinking of globalization as the kind of like flattening out economic superpowers who take over in a kind of neo-colonial way, but also the possibility that people get together, and there's through the connection there are mutual stories which can be told, and raises public awareness.
So you were asking about bridges that could be built. Yeah. I think first we would have to negotiate a lot of things that are in between these different interests, these different actors, these different voices. Yeah? To even make these spaces negotiable is a great thing, but also I see there's a couple of moments where you basically want to change the conversation somehow. Yeah? You mentioned the social history of art. It's actually another way to write and tell the history. And once you start doing that, which I think is an amazing project of the future, in Paris there's now a study program of the social history of art. I think it's the first of its kind, at least in France, maybe in Europe. So, and this is a hint that actually the consciousness and the way to look at things in societies and cultures is changing. Yeah? But then you come up with other narratives, with other questions, and you look at different relationships, and then you might come out of certain paradigms. Like the museum that we're discussing today might be totally uninteresting for us in 50 years, because our interests actually change, because we change the conversations about these places and these objects. Yeah? And another thing is, I totally agree with you, Susanne, that it's helpful also to maybe push the topic further into the future. Now we're dealing with a Nefertiti copy that is here, that is a high-resolution 3D print, which is one of the most contemporary technologies that we have in the 21st century. And we all know that this will change our cultures and our daily lives. And it will not be in such a far future that we will be capable to print objects on an atomic level, yeah? Like atom per atom. So in a while, it will be possible to have an exact atomic copy of the Berlin Nefertiti, and it would be impossible and only with some high-end technologies to actually make the distinction with what object is the copy, what is the original. And once we all get trained to these sort of cultures, and that will happen in the next 50 years, we will again have another conversation. And then the whole debate about restitution might not be so passionate anymore, because our relationship to these objects might be very, very different, actually.
I already talked.
No, there's always something that I'm fascinated by is that I remember I was in Italy and I was asking to my friend, I don't understand why you're still voting for Berlusconi. Because I was telling them 100% of people I know in Italy are against Berlusconi. And my friend told me, well, you probably know 1% of the Italians. So there's also something like, no matter what we're talking about, and you were addressing the new technology thing. And I think that this is, an artist can work within a certain circle. The same thing than an academic. When we talk about talking to the masses, I'm not sure that a PhD in art history or a PhD in archaeology can really reach the masses, and I'm not sure the masses would be interested in reading. So there's a need to create a lot of bridges. And I think that the most powerful instrument nowadays is television, is internet, is etc., etc. Because there's a strategy of sniper that must be put out there, and not just a conversation among people who are convinced. The bridge would be to create events, to these galleries, random surrealists, so all those new trends in art history, they were creating actions that could be taken and that could circulate. All of that and then make people think, because it's not enough, unfortunately. It's terrible that an artist has to do that. It's not enough nowadays to create your art, to create awareness. You have also, by the time you're creating your art, find the links, find the roots, find the system to make the discussion out there on the street and within those people we call the people.
I do agree a lot, and I think also part of the discourse that has a bit succeeded in Egypt is actually this is a very emotional thing to Egyptians. If you go out on the street and ask people, where do you think Nefertiti is? They will tell you, here at the Tahrir Museum. People cannot even imagine that she's not here because she's so much a symbol of Egyptian ancient culture. So I think also putting it down into different campaigns, for example, like Bring Nefertiti. Think about how many Egyptians, and even I think also many international figures, would really think that, yes, maybe this is a good cause. And regular people on the street, I think from different countries are going to identify it. And I think they're also creating, in the new Amarna Museum, they're going to create an empty case for it. And they will write on the empty case, Nefertiti, who was stolen and now in the Noise Museum. So I think these discourses, many people can have access to, because I understand it's very difficult for people to have accessibility to the academic circles, but I think putting it down into causes that they can passionately be part of would really move things.
I don't know, I never estimated that people are working here in museums, but this is a great idea. This empty case, well, I mean, that's probably so. It would never written it gone, but come later. She went shopping. She went shopping in Meter.
No, but what you're saying is, I mean, this shows again that there's a huge, we talk about entangled history, but there's a huge divide, because in Germany, there's no need to create pressure groups, for example, or, I mean, they are, but since they are so, the political awareness is very little, and there are only few artists who, we have, I think Avenir, for example, this is an artist group, or No Humboldt 21, which is a group which tries to fight against the new Prussian castle, which will be the museum for the former ethnographic collections. which is built like right in the center of Berlin, which is, I think, it's kind of another history of like scandal. But there are no pressure groups in a way, because the public has no need to, like, why should we
be bothered?
Yeah, we bothered, exactly. We have heard that these things are here. We somehow still like our collections. And for me, it's again, and the museums don't take their responsibility, because if they would lose the collections. I mean, that's why I think. Because I was really like thinking a lot, like, why? Why don't they give things back? So why is it so difficult? I mean, the case is so clear in a way.
They were run out of their jobs.
Yeah, they were out of their job. And that was, I think, also what we were discussing earlier. It's the question of money, and it's state possession, and it's worth of billions, the collections in the meanwhile. And you were telling the example of a museum in England that you can refer to, how much money they gained out of reselling artifacts. And the museums are price machines. And so I just wanted to show you one which is so cynical. The state museums of Berlin, but also the Louvre, the Goethe Museum, Metropolitan Museum of Art, Rijksmuseum Amsterdam, Thyssen-Bornemisza, St. Petersburg, Whitney Museum, Institut of Chicago. They all signed a treaties in 2007, which is the treasure of world culture and public museums. So they signed a declaration where they said they will not give things back, and they say, I just quote from that, of course not for any claim of unconditional return to the place of origin of a work of art would legally be questionable, and also would show no respect for the history and the fate of the object. So the objects have an own fate when they just landed in Berlin. It just happened. And they said that they talk about the pricelessness of these things. And so for me, it's just a document of cynicism, because it's absolutely not about pricelessness. Like pricelessness might be an ethical point, but it's certainly not. But you won't know more about the prices, I think.
I think this is a huge problem, which is commodifying heritage, giving heritage a price or a value. And I think this is also propagated more by the art market. The more the illicit market, the more people think, and I think Angela can then tell the story of the sale of the second-class pass in Northampton.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, because there is a museum in the UK, very near to, not too far from London, and it had a very small budget, but they wanted to expand their grounds and their activities and their exhibitions, so they did. And to do that, they were going to sell off some pieces of their collections that they weren't displaying anymore. And they said this particular ancient Egyptian statue they hadn't displayed since 2010. And so it was sold at Christie's for the largest ever sum for nearly 16 million sterling pounds, not Egyptian. Very important, the largest ever price gained at an auction house for a piece of Egyptian antiquities. And 6 million of that went to the Lord, who had given the piece to the museum to begin with. In 1850, his family, of course, gave it. Before laws like what you're talking about and international treaties governed some of the trade around archaeological excavations and artifacts. So as a response, the Museums Association in the UK is trying to determine if this particular museum is a museum or a brokerage house for artifacts, art, culture, and whatever else they apparently are going to be selling. And again, they take the money from Egyptian antiquities, sell it, distribute it to the persons who gave it to them, take the rest of it after giving the portion to the auction house, and then use it, if this is true, to expand their collections for citizens in the UK, whereas the Egyptian citizens receive nothing from that sale.
I think also the problem is that it's not being sold to a museum, it's being sold to a private collection of content. So it's depriving the whole world from having accessibility to the object. So I think this also should ethically be addressed by extent.
Yeah, but for me it's also the question, I mean, these are structures which are very difficult to get to. I mean, I don't know, when you're working as an archaeologist, how far you have like a connection to governments. And it's also even I'm working at a university, I'm not in the position yet when I can, or let's say from differently. For me it's a choice whether I would go the legal way, or like in terms of trying to say, okay, I'm trying to participate in lawsuits against the German government for the objects, or am I focusing on a more symbolic way? That means that I, for example, write about art who addresses these questions, or do I use my historical knowledge to tell the story in magazines, newspapers, academic articles, so on which level do I work? And I think this is for me, it's because I'm not a lawyer, I don't know the legal thing, but I'm not in the position in a way to, I don't know, to destroy the art market, fortunately. But for me, it's then the question, like, if you're not in a position to deal with these very important levels, so what can we do? What can I do? And then it comes down to working with artists who at least, or write about them who at least try to do that on a symbolic level. And there are some artists who, for example, Otto Kanga, she's an artist. She worked also with the Frankfurt Museum, and she found their objects from West African histories she never saw in Nigeria or Ghana. And she kind of had posters printed with these objects, how they were used. They were printed in Lagos, and they were just distributed in West Africa, so that people get a knowledge about objects they have never seen, but which are part of the history. And for me, this is a kind of, it's not a restitution, but a kind of a symbolic restitution in a way, trying to circulate at least knowledge and to share knowledge if you cannot share it with the object at the moment. So this maybe is just a step in history, but but also it would be interesting how to interrupt the market. But I mean, for me, this is kind of like, how should I ever be able to do that? I mean,
I think by publicly attacking it. What we need to is to grow an awareness that it's uncool to have objects. It's unethical. It's like blood diamonds. I think the more, I think even also artistic installations that talk about this, engaging the public in protection of the heritage, is people need to look like that. It's like children abuse, child abuse. People need to think about buying antiquities, that it is that unethical.
Well, that's where communication comes to fore, because if you say child abuse, everybody has a notion of child, and you know what that means. But we're dealing with things that people might not even know they exist. And I'm sure that when people received the poster that Otto produced, maybe they discovered and those objects were theirs, quote unquote, and that they were lying down in Frankfurt in the museum. I remember visiting Clementi's museum. There was this chair, abandoned chair. I was there with an artist friend of mine, and he looked at the label and said, no, this is coming from the kingdom, that's where it's coming from. This is not the right chair, this is a queen's chair, and the king's chair is not there. And it's interesting, but again, I think that hence the actions, hence the performances, hence things that can be directly given to the public. I think that if you want to strategize all those things, we need to have communication. We need to make people cry, as you suggested. We need to play with emotion. We need to play with whatever works. But then in order to do that, we need to know to whom we're talking. Because we won't be able to break the market. But maybe we'll be able to create an awareness. This awareness is it's not to the museum that we need to talk. It's to the people who are visiting the museum.
Yeah, but that's not a question I have for you, because I was really interested, like, how to create this, the attachment. And if you don't talk about heritage in terms of state possession, or in terms of like heritage in state of money, what would be, you're talking about, like, you work with people, so what would be a term of heritage for you which wouldn't fall into that category? Well, how to stop the state from taking over?
I think that's by empowering the people. I think there is a huge division here between Egypt and the heritage, and I think it's not very separate from the colonial world, because if you look at any exhibition of Egyptian objects outside of Egypt, it will have almost no mention of modern Egypt. Academics and scholars see ancient Egypt and modern Egypt as two hermetically sealed entities. There's no relation, there's no continuum of history. While the way I see it personally is like a palimpsest. It's different layers of history, one on top of each other. And you can even see that, for example, in the Theban necropolis, they had to remove all the people and put them somewhere else because their history of 200 years of living in the tombs was not appreciated by the state. The state chose that they wanted an authentic view of the Theban necropolis, and so they wiped out all the houses that were built on top of the tombs. So I think there need to be more internal discourse in Egypt and more empowerment of Egyptians and more respect to their social history by the state and also by academics, because Egyptology is a science that originated in the West. It was by Champollion, so.
Even Champollion in Egypt, they say Champollion.
Yeah. So I think this whole idea that we have, I studied in Western universities, and the way I think about Egyptology is the same probably as any Western scholar. But we need to rethink of how we exhibit ancient Egypt, and this should also be transferred in how ancient Egypt is exhibited within Egypt, in Egyptian museums, in the way we deal with archaeological sites, because if you think about how many archaeological missions, and particularly German archaeological missions in Egypt, I think there are around 20 missions, 20 just German missions in Egypt. How many of them are taking time to educate the communities they're working at? How many of them even take their workmen who are Egyptian and show them and explain to them the archaeological site and its interpretation? Almost non-existent. They just barely started after we started putting them under fire to do it, but they do it pour la force. They really don't do it thinking that this is the only way they're going to protect this heritage. This is the only way they're going to safeguard the heritage for the next generations. So I think there should also be more pressure on Western academics working in Egypt. And we as Egyptians are also putting very strong pressure on the government to involve the people, to get people to have a say about what heritage they want exhibited and how they should see museums, their accessibility to the archaeological sites. And before 2011, they used to close the Giza Plateau for Egyptians. Egyptians were seen as a nuisance to the tourists. So I think tourism as a form of neo-colonialism used to win over the Egyptian cultural rights. I perfectly believe that the pyramids area is just a perfect picnic area. It's absolutely fine that Egyptians should go on their national holiday of Sharm el-Sheikh. It's just completely closed off for Egyptians. So I think there is now more discourse about this, and I can see also human rights groups are giving enough attention to the cultural rights. There is the Egyptian Social and Economic Center here. They help us start lawsuits against the government, against accessibility issues, and against. So I think there is more movement because it's disconnected from the movement in Europe, and I think both should work in a parallel form.
And that said, the only thing that makes really sense is to negotiate our future, right? So when we go to renegotiate our past, our heritage, the only project is certainly one that is in front of us. And within that conversation, I would always ask also whether we want to, for example, invest 100 million into some sort of dealing with our heritage, or 100 million, or at least 50 million of them, into the production of our contemporary culture. Yeah? Many Western countries spend something like 95% on the preservation of their heritage and less money into the production of our culture today and tomorrow. And we also have to have the conversation whether this is actually the right balance into what money we collectively invest into our artifacts and models of identification and all that. This point actually misses terribly very often in these discussions.
On that point, we'd like to open up the discussion to those in attendance and questions or comments about what you heard.
Thank you. It was very dense. Actually, comments and one question about water vision in 2 times. Of course, it's the poet who writes history, and I'm afraid someday that petrol power will not get us to destroy again some other Banyan and Panil. And it was a question about that on the Egyptian TV about destroying the pyramid. It's not a joke. Water vision, again, because the 3D reproductions will bring again the question he asked about reproduction of works of art. It was in 2D at that time. And I think it's accurate. It's a real about restitution. I think it's a very important point. The third thing is about restitution. How, maybe this is a question to the archaeologists, how far the new Egyptian museum is concerned by history or society or whatever else. What is this new point of view? You have an idea clear, but I still don't have one. The actual Egyptian museum made by Mariette, and it's the end of the 19th century. It did not move, not a hair. You can find it in the drawings, whatever. It did not move, just maybe a little bit dirty. So what is the ideology? What is the program? Really, rewriting history is necessary. I think writing history, maybe by the powerful, is necessary. Rewriting it is also necessary. And rewriting it and contesting it, rewriting is also necessary. This is life. It's not a problem to have history written. We need it for education, and we need to demolish it also. So, what is the new perspective of the new Egyptian museum?
I think there is no perspective.
Thank you.
There's going to be the problem is that it's just a vanity project. We wanted to do the biggest museum.
Very far from Cairo.
Very far from Cairo, quite inexpensive.
Not for Egyptians.
Not for Egyptians, and I think even not for tourists, because tourists are usually get very tired from visiting museums around Cairo. And if tomorrow I have a say about the fate of the Grand Egyptian Museum, I would turn it into a research facility and storeroom, and improve the Cairo Museum and other museums, because we also have the Civilization Museum. And again, they have given the exhibition to be written by a foreign company that's written. So there is no even local rhetoric. No, yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, it's the Kawaga is better mentality.
Start from here.
Yeah, and this is a huge problem because the museum is going to be a vision of, it's going to be very fragmented. They're collecting objects from all over Egypt, and they keep on changing. I think they've changed it something like 27 times because no one agrees, and each new director comes says, oh, this is rubbish, redo it again, and then it continues. And I think the museum is not going to be open before, I think my daughter is at university. She's 1 year old now, so I think we'll have plenty of years to debate the fate of the Grand Egyptian Museum.
Good evening. I would like to speak in Arabic, please. Okay. بالنسبة المنتصر هو الذي يكتب التاريخ. لحسن حظنا ان المنتصرين والاستعماريين هم الذين حافظوا على تراثنا. واذا كانوا بنوا متاحف عندنا للحفاظ على هذا التراث، ايضا المتاحف عندهم ومالوها بتراثنا، ولكنها لا زالت محفوظه. الخطر فقط هو عند تجار التراث، وقد ساهم كثيرون من حكامنا في تشجيع هؤلاء التجار، بل واغتنوا الوراء ولا زالوا. حضرتك اثرتي نقطه ان يجب مراعاه العامه الشعب في اعاده تقييم التراث وتخطيطه، ولكن للاسف العامه في غيبوبه وليس لديهم الوعي. وهو سكان منطقه الاهرام نزلة السمان وغيره هم لا يفهموا ما هذه المباني الضخمه وما هذه الحجاره. الناس ياتون من كل فج يزوروها وهم لا يهتموا بها ولا يفهموها ايضا. فكيف نراعيهم ونحن على مر العصور انشانا قوم مغيب؟ كان من الاولى ان يغيروا حكامهم الفاسدين وزعمائهم الجهلاء بالتراث. التراث انا بعتبر ان التراث سواء نفرتيتي موجوده في برلين ولا في القاهره ولا في نيودلهي ولا في اي حته ليست مهمه، ولكن المهم الحفاظ على القطعه الاثريه الفنيه. وليس مهم ايضا ان تكون هي الاثر الاساسي او النسخه منها ايضا، لان المشاهد هو لا يدرك الفارق. والاستاذ قال كمان ان التكنولوجيا الحديثه مكنت من انه او ممكن ان تمكن من انك تعمل نسخ طبق الاصل ولا تستطيع التفريق بينها. يعني فهو يعني انا اقصد دي كمان سلطه الدوله وحقها في انها تهدي اثار هي ليست ملكها، ويجب حمايه التراث من هؤلاء الفاسدين اللي هو يعني واحد حاكم او رئيس جمهوريه بيزور بلد او يعمل مجامله يروح مديله معبد نص معبد ولا ما اعرفش تمثال. يعني ده ما هوش ملكيه خاصه له. وشكرا. في امور اخرى ولكني اشكركم.
Shall I respond in Arabic or in English?
Yeah, English.
Okay, I think the question is very valid, and I think again it has to do with the bad education. I mean, if you look at how Egyptians learn about their cultural heritage at school, it's a public menace, really. And it's very shameful that كتاب الدراسات الاجتماعية or the book of social history is what the Egyptians used to learn about their history. We've done many initiatives to try and help with that, but it's not going through. What we've done is offer the Ministry of Antiquities to do regional curricula for cultural heritage, where we can have the regional curricula of Middle Egypt, the regional curricula of Upper Egypt, the regional curricula of Sinai, and try to get the school students involved. I understand that it's quite too late for the current generation, but at least we're investing in the upcoming generations, and I really hope, I think the Ministry of Antiquities has both the idea and they're trying to implement it. Whether it's going to fly or not, this is, we have to see for the upcoming days. But I think all the different stratums of the Egyptian society, they have an idea about cultural heritage, and they can have a say. And with a little bit of discussion, most of them want to benefit economically from the cultural heritage. And I think this is a very strong sign. And it's also to be respected, because if you compare between the reaction in the preservation of sites between Luxor and Saqqara and Memphis, you can really tell why in Luxor, during the 18 days of the 2011 uprising, the Gurnawis, the Luxor people, came out with their sticks and rifles and protected the whole archaeological area, while here in Memphis and Saqqara, they were calling each other in microphones to go out and loot. You can really tell the difference, because people in Luxor are benefiting economically, and of course they have an effective relation with the heritage. While people here in Giza and Memphis and Saqqara, they're walled out of the heritage. There's no development. There's no tying the people to the activities economically. So they really have a very poor relationship. The only way they can benefit economically is by selling whatever they can. So I think also the government needs to pay attention to this, that they cannot protect a site by just building a wall around it. What they need actually is to break down this wall and get people actively benefiting from the archaeological site. Because if they know that this is the chicken that's laying full eggs, they're going to keep the chicken alive. Thank you.
Yeah, but maybe just to contribute, I mean, it's a very complicated question because, first of all, the term heritage, well, in the last years, or 20 years, there has been the discussion about shared heritage. We said, you're right, the objects have to be somehow preserved, but how can we at least acknowledge that it's not ours? So we have the concept of shared heritage. But actually, usually it does just mean that you bring like the knowledge and the possession stays with the like Paris, Britain, Germany. But these contracts usually never involve some sharing of the profits. Like Berlin makes so much money with having Nefertiti. But this doesn't, where you can say, hey, we share in terms that we bring all like half of the money or whatever, I don't know, to put it into the infrastructure of building museums here, or working on the infrastructure of education in terms of exactly these purposes you are describing. So this is the problem, because the way you argued is usually used by politicians in Germany to say, you see, we cannot, because the governments are corrupt, they don't have the infrastructure, so we cannot give anything back. And this is a very paternalistic argument, which just prolongates, in a way, the chauvinistic colonial attitude. And I think if we would go to different kind of negotiations, in terms of what does sharing mean, or if you can negotiate the conditions of sharing on an equal level, then we would be in a different situation.
May I comment on this? Thank you for your contribution too, and thank all of you for the great discussion so far. That's because you were talking now about sharing, and I heard twice now you talking about the new technologies and how we could deal with this in the future. I'm a bit more cultural pessimistic on that, because for almost 7 or maybe even 10 years, the museum in Berlin, for example, used to have the 3D data of this Nefertiti and of all the other artifacts, and it would have been so easy to share them with all the world, actually, not only with Egyptians, but with everybody. So for me, it's not about the technology, it's about the notion, and the notion is obviously not changing now, but to give you a small example, which is a very bright example, I don't know, maybe not overall, but it's a starting point. That the British Museum, for example, they last year, I think, or 2 years ago, they opened all their data from their scans from very, very important objects to the public. And while they did it, in the first 3 hours, there were over millions downloads. The server cracked down. So that's what I wanted to say about the relevance of artifacts today. It's there. And I don't think it was like only all the academics around the world waiting for this to happen. So, yeah. But that actually shows us we have to have a more intense discourse, and we have to change the mindset. Yeah.
But you managed to get those 3Ds. Maybe it will encourage people to set them free.
Yes, just a very interesting thing. Maybe this is also interesting for Egypt. The British Museum, they also did public scan-a-thons, they called it. Everyone could go with a camera or a scanning device to the museum and scan it. In Berlin, that's of course not allowed. And we didn't collaborate with the museum at all in our art project. So I don't know if everyone knows of you about what we did today. We were announcing to release all 3D data we have from the Nefertiti, of course, as a representative for all the other objects which are still also digitally possessed, not only the artifact itself. Yeah.
So Nora was very modest. I don't know if everybody understands. So the data that they process right now of the original Nefertiti will be shared as a shared commons, like an open source data available to everybody. So this is a very symbolic and very political gesture that they are doing. And again, it's one of these examples where I think artists are trying to push some stuff in the debate and actually in the practice really. They are making use, in this case, of contemporary media and technologies that we didn't even have 10 years ago. And these are the points I think we should look at and search for. And there are a few people out there who are actually really contributing to this in ways that we would not imagine ourselves here eventually.
You talked much about archaeology and you didn't talk about contemporary art. I want to connect both somehow. The question is, yeah, we know that that a piece of art has a value as its type, and later, after some years, it takes historical value, not artistic. I mean, the artistic value fades away and takes a historical value. So the question is, contemporary museums, contemporary art museums, which holds such pieces, does it play the role or the same role of the archaeological museums? I mean, we talked much about this. You mentioned all the points, all the negative points about archaeological museums and how they freeze the object. I mean, the art piece or the art object, can it later, when it becomes historical and it's owned by the contemporary museum, does it get freezed also? The same, can we say the same what we say about archaeology? Can we say the same?
Well, it's frozen in another manner. You know, the planet is getting warmer and warmer. So I guess Michelangelo is frozen, but it's frozen in a different manner than Nefertiti or Tutankhamun, etc. And nowadays, other frozen items are going to become. And as far as the historical value, we know, I use that example because it's the easier one, that Margot died totally poor and desperate, and he was the only artist of his time to defeat Dr. Picasso, King Picasso, in an auction. But then time, when we're talking about archaeology, maybe the Contemporary Museum, if ever somebody doesn't press the wrong button, will become a kind of an archaeology of the times that we cannot imagine. Well, I don't know what will be on Earth, but we'll be looking at the paintings on a little ridiculous thing, not only anymore as art production, but as representation of the people who lived there millions of years, if ever there's a future for Earth. But the value, the historical value, is linked, when we're talking about those artifacts, is linked with history and with society. Now my question is that, are the archaeologists of the future get any information of the contemporary art production in order to tell about the society we live in? This is another question.
No, I think there are also I have two answers to your question. One is, I mean, I think this is the task also of writers and everyone to always re-articulate the problem an artwork was an answer to, or at least and trying to always say, okay, this was the impact the artist wanted to do, instead of treating art as a mere object, which it's not. I mean, it's thought, it's intellectual work, it's material intellectual work. So to re-articulate that in order not to get frozen. And on the other hand, I'm also, I think, we are a little bit, we get a bit wrong when we say the objects are frozen in museums, because also going to museums is a practice in a way, it's a contemporary practice. In a way, so maybe the history is frozen, but the practice is not frozen. And so I would like to ask, so this goes back to Monica, if this is a contemporary practice, which story is told, and which is so if we say it's frozen, we kind of maybe don't get the point of the high value of the museum and also the educational function, and in which way they should educate. And the third thing is, maybe I'll leave it to that. But I think this is also, the story of freezing is not totally right. Exactly, this was the third point I want to say, because when they said we need contemporary practices to enliven these objects and contemporary artists to work with them. I think this is not, we can do that. This is one way. But it's a new sense, a new layer which is added to the object. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the old object. And we were discussing it before. Is it okay if Nefertiti is such a state symbol? In which way is Nefertiti taken seriously? Is she taken seriously as like a co-ruler in terms of what would that mean for the position of power, women power in a country? So if she's like an equal ruler, as what do we take her as a state symbol? This would be also for me to freeze an image from its near iconic status, a state symbol, and again take the object seriously and to ask, so which narratives do we create and how to recirculate the knowledge?
I mean, don't you think that your voice not frozen now, for example, in German?
Well, I mean, as long as his ideas are taken up, well, I'm not a fan of Joe's voice to say it, but if his ideas are taken up again, well, certainly, I mean, this happens to all art, but this is, I think, which is important why we have art history or art criticism, to try to retell the impact and not to leave it as a fetish object, as a dead object, but again, like to try to recreate the impulse and, yeah.
No, as long as the impulse is there, the object is not dead, even if it's frozen, the object itself is not dead. But there's something, when we talk about history, we have to remember, when we say contemporary art, we think that we're giving a definition of something specific. But when we go back to the grammar, it means the art that is produced now. And Nefertiti was contemporary in her time, the same way Michelangelo was contemporary. So contemporaneity is something that is moving with the time. And what is produced now might become classic, maybe modern than classic than archaeological.
Yes, and I mean, I join you. There's nothing bad about that. Like at some point, you could also say there's a vague vocabulary that some people start to use, and there are very few using that vocabulary, and at some point, actually many people start speaking that way, or thinking that way, and then it becomes historic. But there's nothing bad about that. It's just a natural process, maybe. And something that was not said is that many, actually most, by far the most contemporary artists actually produce for these specific spaces and their conditions of perception. So the museum is not freezing objects, it's actually the place for which these artists made these objects. You can still feel that they are freezed in there, but this is the condition of their creation, and it's actually their aim most often to be there. So this is indeed a practice.
Okay, with that, we'd like to choose one.
Sorry, I was waiting. Thank you for this rich discussion. It's incredibly important. But there's one thing that I want to go back to, which relates to what we were just talking about, and it really stuck in my mind, was this comment that you made about the empty Nefertiti case. Because it's an incredible symbol of, it's an incredible political statement, and also not so far from the ways in which contemporary artists are working and using acts of subversion to critique these things. So I was very curious who it was that came up with this idea, and whether or not this is going to be used as a political tactic to then critique the infrastructure of the museum are other objects going to be represented in this way, and is it being used in other museums to critique this kind of the stolen objects in ethnographic?
It's a local, it's an archaeologist from Minya, from the hometown of Nefertiti, who thought about the empty case, and he's the one responsible for the scenario. The museum was partly funded by Egypt, but now I think it needs 10 million euros to finish its display. So the deal was that the Noise Museum is going to pay for the museum as long as they remove this empty case. But, but then
wow.
the negotiations.
But that says something, right?
Yeah, but then the negotiations stagnated and they kept the empty case. The museum is not going to pay for it, and hopefully they're going to manage to fundraise for it from a different perspective.
No.
The negotiation stagnated because they wanted to keep the empty case, or because the museum just didn't have the money?
No, it stagnated because they wanted to have no discussion of the repatriation of Nefertiti whatsoever. This was the deal. Either we completely sign off Nefertiti to the Noise Museum, or they give us the money to finish the museum.
On that point, then, we'd like to thank you for coming, the panelists as well, and the Institute for hosting the dialogue tonight. Please do get over and look at the other Nefertiti. Maybe she's more alive than the one frozen in Berlin, the one that could come back to the case of the museum in cinema.
Yeah.
Thank you.